Hey everyone, it's Kristan, and welcome to this new episode of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. We are in season 3, and we're talking about having difficult, hard conversations. So joining me today is Anna Lulis on our team at Students for Life. She's our data strategist. But Anna, I wanted you to come on today to talk about a little bit about your experience. You recently graduated from Liberty University as a Catholic, so you're president of the Catholic group there. But I want to talk about talking to Christians who support abortion and contraception, because I can think of no other thing that's more frustrating than talking to people who should be with us who clearly aren't. So I know you've probably had a lot of conversations, maybe Catholic to Protestant or Catholic to Catholic about abortion, about contraception. So I want to dig into that today and see if you have any nuggets of wisdom for us when we have these frustrating conversations. Okay, so let's start with talking to Protestants about abortion.
Yeah.
Go. No. What kind of conversations have you had with Protestants about abortion who support abortion? What kind of arguments do you most commonly hear in support of abortion? And then how do you respond?
Yeah, so I would hear a lot of biblical support for abortion, specifically concerning God's will. So God willed abortion into society because humans lack free will. And this comes from Calvinist theology, mainly. Some areas of Christianity don't believe in the idea of free will. So when you neglect that and start talking about these issues like abortion, they tend to think because there's no free will within society that God willed evils like abortion or miscarriages. And so they present all these different arguments about how God predestined individuals for heaven or hell. And so abortion doesn't really matter, quite frankly, because either way, God knows whether or not they're going to be saved or not. And then just having those conversations and really diving down the path of what do you understand in terms of theology, what do we agree on, and try to build from there. As Christians, we have fundamental issues that we should all universally rally
killing
around.
babies is wrong.
Yeah,
it's a sin.
Once we're able to find that point that we're able to agree on whatever issue it is, then we can build off of there and then retarget the abortion issue again. So really just calming the situation down and understanding.
Because what's the point of doing any good in the world, right, or attempting to change or transform the world into a better place if this is all just, if this act of violence was predestined anyway?
Right. And that was the point I would make to these individuals. Like, why care about anything? Why care about murder? Why care about helping the poor? And when we started diving deeper into these issues, then people were starting to resonate with the idea of, okay, maybe there isn't a biblical argument for abortion, and dialing that conversation back to the starting point. Like, is abortion wrong, yes or no? And if so, what should we do to help these individuals?
Did you ever try like a tactic when we speak sometimes, or when I speak to pro-abort sometime and I'm having a long conversation with them, a lot of times we'll trot off the toddler, right? We're like, well, I don't think child abuse is right, but I can't dictate. I mean, because surely these people, like, if you would say, well, you know, what about slavery? God just totally wills people to be enslaved and raped, and that's all great, like,
right?
But their answer is like, well, no, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is what's God's will.
Right. And a lot of arguments they would make would be, well, you don't understand what's right and wrong, because our understanding of good and evil in society is different than God's understanding of what's good and evil in society. And so dialing back the conversation, like I said before, and talking about like, well, what does God care about? Why did God mention in the Bible to go and help the most vulnerable in society if that was the case? And once you're able to have a discussion on whether or not has full control or wills certain evils into society and start that conversation there, then you can build it up to the issue of abortion and compile it with these other issues God talks and clearly mentions in the Bible. Like he specifically said, go out and feed the poor, help the poor.
Yeah.
Why? You know, if there is no free will, if God predestines everything in society, why would that be the case? And you can also apply that argument to the issue of abortion.
Okay, so there's a God's will argument that you heard on campus.
Yes.
Have you ever heard the argument? I was debating a Christian theologian for, I think it was a medical school campus in New York State a couple months ago. And I don't think we've ever I think we did make some of the video footage available. It's really interesting because it's supposed to be a polite discussion. I wasn't supposed to yell or get angry. But I was corresponding with her afterwards. I was actually trying to get her to come to the podcast, and she won't. But she said something to me, and I've read it since, so in Jeremiah 1:5, God said, basically says, I knew you before I formed you in the womb, right? Mm-hmm. And her argument was that wasn't a blanket statement that he knows every fetus and every womb, that this was a special circumstance, that God ordained this one person for a special purpose or special plan. Therefore, it doesn't apply to abortion in general. And so I've read that a couple other times that they say, well, pro-life Christians take Jeremiah 1:5 out of context. Have you ever heard that argument?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
And it goes back to the idea of, well, God predestined individuals to be saved or to be condemned. And my defense or argument against that would be, well, why care about the martyrs then? Like, blessed are the persecuted, but at the same time, like, I'm not going to rejoice in the idea of, like, you come into this world and I want you to face persecution. Like, it's going to happen no matter what, but I don't want you to die over that necessarily. And I definitely wouldn't advocate for that in any situation. So why do that in the case for abortion? Like, even if, say, God does predestine people to heaven or hell, why would you still want that for any individual? Doesn't that make you angry inside? And within the Bible, it does talk about helping the most vulnerable in society. So how can you say it's perfectly okay for individuals to have an abortion because that child may go to heaven or it may go to hell? It doesn't matter, nevertheless. Just like martyrs willingly go into a situation knowing their life is going to be taken away, but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen because I value that individual's life. And I think that's where the argument really needs, or discussion really needs to come back to, is just the dignity of human life in general and what that means as a Christian.
Sounds like you've had a lot of conversations about this. Did you have a lot of conversations at Liberty?
I did, yeah. So, and a lot of individuals disagree on theology, so you really have to just bring it back to what makes sense. Like, even if we don't agree on everything, like, I'm a Catholic, so I believe in the sacraments. Even if you don't believe in the sacraments, like, we should still agree on these fundamental issues and a lot of these social issues that the Bible calls us to get behind. And I think that's where I would love to see unity within Christianity, specifically on the issue of abortion. So
yeah, the God ordains only certain people. And it was interesting because when I was corresponding with the theologian post the debate, she actually was, she emailed me and was like, let me give you some critiques of your presentation. So she told me what she thought I wasn't so strong on, but she said multiple times that my strongest point was this whole question of, well, how do you know if a fetus is ordained? Like, when a mother goes into an abortion facility to have an abortion, how do you know if that fetus is suddenly a person and has been ordained by God or isn't? Because we don't have like a direct communication channel with God. Say, hey, that one's saved, that one's fine, get rid of. Like that. Like, so wouldn't you want to? The question I asked her was, well, wouldn't you want to err on the side of caution? It's like the Randy Alcorn use this argument in the Pro-Life Answers to Pro-Choice Arguments book, where it was like, if you're driving at night and you see a shadow in the road and you're not sure if it's just a shadow or it could be like a child, what do? Well, you have to stop.
Right.
Like, you have to err on the side of caution that this could be a child. I don't want to run over a child. You don't just keep going forward and go, oh yeah, it's just a shadow, it's nothing. And so that was an argument that I think resonated with her, because she couldn't admit that any one of us knows in her worldview what fetus would be the special ordained fetus, and which one would just be like a normal fetus they can get rid of. All right, so those are two of the arguments I've heard from Protestants, and I'm ganging up on you because you went to Liberty. Another argument, and I don't know if you've ever heard this one, of ensoulment. Have you ever heard an argument of ensoulment? Of there's different theories of when a human being receives their soul.
Yeah. So, I mean, this issue wasn't as discussed or broadly discussed as the issue of abortion and biblical support for that. But when we would talk about a stance on, okay, if a soul enters a human body at this specific point, is it okay to abort the child beforehand? And absolutely not, because no matter what stage of human development a human being may be in at that time, doesn't take away the dignity of that life, that human being. And I think we go back to the idea of, like, I can be 80 years old and I can have some, or even have some deformity in life, but that doesn't take away my value and my worth to society. And then going back to the issue of, well, you have your soul at that time, that's a different argument completely. I would say, well, you could parallel it to, that's a stage of human development. And no matter what, even if you make the argument or you truly believe your soul may enter a human body a week after conception, 2 weeks after conception, at the end of the day, that's the potential for life is still there. And they are developing into what their potential, and that a human being, and they already are a human being at that point, but just, it doesn't matter.
It's not like what you have, but it's what you can have.
Exactly. And that the idea of the potential for that is extremely valuable, and it provides worth to society. And once you neglect that, you neglect somebody's worth. And having that conversation, I think, opens a lot of people's eyes up to the idea of, well, I didn't really see that before. You changed my perspective on that argument, just referring to the idea of a human being having dignity no matter their stage of development. Okay.
I get that. Now, here's a hard one that I heard one time, and I didn't really have a good response to it. So I was out in front of an abortion facility praying, and I don't know if this person came up to yell at me or I can't remember the point of the person being there, but they said something to me, and they said to the fact of, well, all these babies are being aborted have a direct ticket to heaven. So it's actually, like, it's not great, but why would we fight against that? Because if they were born, they could sin and fall away from the Lord and end up in hell. So it's actually, like, okay that they end up in heaven because they got a direct shot.
Well, I would trace this back to the argument of, it doesn't matter if an individual is going to heaven or hell. Like, no individual has the power to determine whether that individual lives or dies. Even if I'm 20 years old, and
what gives you the authority to choose?
Right. And even if I'm living in the state of sin, and I know right now I'm probably not going to go to heaven, being straight up honest with you, I still wouldn't go up to that individual or think of myself as an individual not worth living, or not worth having a value, not worth living. And same with any other individual. I would look at that in their state and the state of grace that they're in, if they are living in the state of grace or not. And even if they're not fully living out the way a Christian should, I wouldn't think their life isn't worth living. I would still think their life has value and dignity. And I think it would seem odd for anybody to suggest otherwise. So even if you have a straight ticket to heaven, like martyrs, for example, we love talking about martyrs, at least Catholics do. And it doesn't, like, being a martyr, great, you're going to heaven, right? But I'm not going to will that upon somebody. I know in the Bible it says blessed are the persecuted, but at the same time, I don't want any individual to walk into a situation where I know they're going to face persecution and wish or want death upon that person. And I think that's an important stance and point to make, quite honestly, because a straight ticket to heaven really shouldn't take away anybody's life, right? Or the value of anybody's life in general. So
I mean, because we are to ease the suffering of the hurting, and we are to serve and help the most vulnerable. That's some charges lobbied against us, right?
Right.
That's what we have to do as Christians. So, all right. So another argument I've heard, mainly from, I can't tell if this is more of a liberal Catholic or liberal Protestant viewpoint, but well, my body is God's temple, is my temple. I have autonomy over what happens in my full body. So where do you go when you have that conversation?
Recognizing that if that human being has a temple too, you know, like
are you a temple inside of a temple?
Right. And so the Bible does talk about, you know, you are a temple and to honor that for the Lord, but at the end of the day, like that child that's inside of you, they have their own temple, and why would you want to tarnish that in any way, especially when the Bible talks about not wanting to tarnish it?
I would think like the violent and intrusive nature of an abortion would also negate that as well. Like you're going to let that happen to your temple?
Right.
Because that's an unnatural, violent act. Like, and maybe the actions leading up to the conception of the pregnancy, you weren't treating your body as a temple either. So maybe that needs to be taken into consideration. So kind of selective hearing, I think. They kind of used like one scripture, one passage as some sort of justification for full bodily autonomy. And of course, anytime someone makes a bodily autonomy argument, regardless of whether or not they're trying to, you know, quote scripture or they're an atheist or agnostic, you can always start and you should talk about, you know, the fact that we do recognize bodily autonomy, but there's some things that you can't do with your body when, you know, and that those rights stop when they infringe on someone else's rights. And then that leads into that discussion of, is there another someone and someone else's rights to take into consideration when we're talking about abortion? So I think you kind of lead into that argument. All right, are there any other conversations that you can recall, arguments that you had as a Catholic student with Protestant students who tried to justify abortion? Because we just went over like 4 or 5. Like,
right.
I think we went over all the ones that were in my head, conversations I know I've had over the years.
Right. And I would just go back to the first argument that I've heard that really I've talked to the most people about was, does God will abortion into society? Because individuals are going to be predestined to heaven or hell, so it doesn't really matter. And going off of the last point you made within that argument, even if a child was predestined to hell, that doesn't take away the right or their rights as a human being, right? Because everybody has intrinsic rights that were given by God. And even if that philosophy was correct, say a person is 20 years old and God condemned them to hell. He predetermined they are going to hell. It's still not right to say that individual's life isn't worth living, right?
Well, I mean, I would actually argue if there's somebody's condemned to hell, then you actually should have to fight harder. You should fight harder for those people to have the right to life, because this is the only like escape they're going to have out of misery and suffering forever. That's
a really good point. Like,
why wouldn't you want to make sure anyone condemned to hell for all eternity at least gets a 70-year reprieve?
Right. No, that's a great point to make, and one that I would point out in a discussion like that. So that argument in and of itself is probably the one I've heard the most, just talking to Christians at Liberty University, or really anywhere.
Okay.
So.
All right. So, and this isn't a scripted podcast, by the way. My podcasts are never scripted, in case you haven't noticed. So I literally jotted down like 6 things, and I told Anna right before we started filming, this is what we're going to talk about. So what about talking to other Catholics? You're a Catholic. I'm a convert to Catholicism, although I think you know more about Protestantism than when I was a Protestant. But what is the main argument you hear when you're talking to a Catholic who supports abortion? Because I mean, with Protestantism, you know, there are churches that are misleading. There are pastors that are wrong. I mean, there's a man running in the U.S. Senate runoff in Georgia. He is the minister at Martin Luther King's old church there in Atlanta, who is a staunch abortion supporter and says that abortion is pro-life. So there are preachers and ministers who are just flat out biblically wrong on this issue. And so you can see why there could be mass confusion within the Protestant world and the Protestant church on abortion, because so many are getting mixed messages. And then you have like the mega pastors the seeker-friendly churches that don't want to upset anybody. So it's like, well, your truth, speak your truth, live your truth. Well, no, there's like just one truth, and it's Jesus Christ. But within the Catholic Church has been very clear about the intrinsic evil of abortion. Now there's priests, and we all can talk about priests who get it wrong. Don't get me started. But there's one argument I hear over and over again from Catholics specifically, because the church has, has listed out so many things that we as Christians should care about. So what's the main argument? I'm sure it's going to be the same one that you hear from pro-choice Catholics, and how do you respond?
I would say essentially the same idea, the same concept of, well, this is my temple. Don't touch my temple.
Oh, really? See, that's not the one I always hear.
Yeah. Well,
so you've heard that one?
With Catholics specifically, most Catholics, since we universally accept a lot of things we should accept all the things the church teaches. I don't really have
By the way, for the Protestants listening, that does not mean you always have to accept everything that comes out of the Pope's mouth.
Yes, that's true.
Took me a while to learn that.
Yes. And so I would say a Catholic's argument in support for abortion would be, well, this is still my body. At the end of the day, like,
my body, my rights,
choice. Yeah.
My body, my rights supersede. Even if the fetus and the child has some rights, I have more.
Right. And I would say the biggest issue would be and Christians are trying to redefine what pro-life means.
Bingo! This is the top one I always hear.
Yeah, and because I think Catholics do pretty well on the issue of abortion or contraception.
Not if you look at polls, though.
Yeah. I mean, the Catholics I've talked to are pretty universal on those arguments. Like I said, if I heard anything, any argument for abortion, it would generally be, well, it's my body at the end of the day. But the biggest issue I would say within Catholicism is how Christians are trying to redefine what being pro-life is.
And they're reprioritizing where the evil of abortion falls on the things that you should care about.
Right. And so they will think immigration issues are in line with abortion. And I'm not saying immigration issues aren't important. I'm just saying they don't fall in line with the pro-life argument at all. Just because what is the pro-life argument? It's the intent on whether or not an individual is going to live or not. And immigration issues don't really affect whether or not an individual will live or die, just to put it quite frank. If an individual does end up dying from that, that's tragic, but that's not the intent of any of those policies. Where if you look at any abortion-related policies, it always has the intent on whether or not a life will be ended or preserved. So I think you have to look at it from that mindset and stop listening to individuals who are trying to redefine what the pro-life movement represents. and quite honestly, what being pro-life means.
Yeah, I saw a lot of this leading up to the election, and we all saw this at Students for Life of this, liberal evangelical, mostly more, it was coming more from the liberal Catholics, but it's starting to come from the liberal evangelical world too.
Right.
Of, well, this is the new pro-life movement. There's actually a group of people who call themselves the new pro-life movement. This is the new pro-life movement, or this is how pro-life really should be, or people actually get mad at like somebody like me because they're like, well, you support and voted for Donald Trump. You're giving all pro-lifers a bad name because he is the, an anti-pro-life president, which is not true. Which is funny because, to be honest with you guys, pro-life has a sucky brand. Like, it's not, we do research all the time at Students for Life and spend a lot of donor funds and investment into how do we have the best arguments and messages to how to convert the fastest way possible. And one of the research studies we engaged in last year was, even though a lot of these mushy middle millennial Gen Z women, 20 to 29-year-olds, didn't like abortion, didn't agree with abortion, they still would not call themselves pro-life or even consider the fact that they may be pro-life because of the brand of who they thought pro-life was, and if they became pro-life, who they would be. That's a problem for us. That's why, you've been out there a lot, in front of the Supreme Court holding pro-life gen signs. We're always intentional about having joyful, happy people, young people in front of the court. Anytime, reporters are going to be out there and they're going to be documenting the pro-life side, we want to be there and showing them who pro-life really is, because we have a tarnished brand. And I just talked about that recently on another podcast. I hope you tuned in. But, so it's funny to me that they want to take the brand, because I'm like, why would you think the brand's really good? So you're trying to steal the brand. But I'm telling you right now, as someone who calls themselves actively pro-life and leads a pro-life organization, that we have to fix our brand. So why would you try to steal the brand? I think it's a stupid business decision. Just in general, it's not a smart decision to be making, but it was a huge thing before the election. And it's always before the election of, what pro-life really is. And within the Catholic Church, there are, absolute sins, right?
Yeah.
And then there's venial sins. And abortion is one of those absolutes. It is an intentional taking of a unique, whole, living human life of a human being that was created in the image of our Maker.
Yes.
That is vastly different than, Kristan, didn't support this politician who supported an immigration policy. It's and don't get me started about immigration and Donald Trump, because actually Donald Trump's immigration policies have helped reduce sex trafficking in our country, but no one ever talks about that. I think it's different. We can have different policy prescriptions for different societal challenges we face. You and I can disagree about school choice, about kids trapped in failing schools. Neither of us want a child to be trapped into a failing inner city school. But you may be pro school choice, I might be anti school choice. But it's not like one of us is committing a sin, because we just deeply disagree about how to get to that best outcome.
Right. And going off of that, I would go further and say, well, if individuals are willing to do that to pro-life movement, or the term pro-life, why don't we do that to pro-choice? The pro-choice term. Mm-hmm. So what Kristan just mentioned, if you're really pro-choice, shouldn't you support school choice?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people would get furious by me even suggesting that. And that's how we feel over on the pro-life side. It's how can you twist a term where everybody knows the intent and the origin of, and apply that to the pro-life movement? You can't do that. If we did that to the pro-choice movement, individuals would go off the wall. So I think taking that into consideration, and we could throw the same thing back right at you guys. It's if you're really pro-choice, you should be for school choice. You should be for the Second Amendment. You should be for religious liberty. I could line all of these things up for you. And a lot of those individuals who identify as being pro-choice would tell me, well, that's not what being pro-choice
Can we
means.
Please write that op-ed? That's your next job task. Write this op-ed. We can get it into some pro-choice magazines. Because That's so right, because they're really not for choice. And the thing we see all the time on campuses with our Pregnant on Campus program too, who shows up for women in crisis on campus to say, no, you are strong enough. You can choose both. You can complete your education and be a mom, and parent a child and raise a child. The pro-choice group on campus doesn't lift a finger to help women who are in crisis, who choose to become a parent, right? Who say, fine, I'm not going to destroy the life of my child, who choose to remain in school and be a parent. They don't do anything. Like, they have nothing they offer women at all. In fact, when you go to Planned Parenthood pregnant, 94% of pregnant women who go into Planned Parenthood are going to get an abortion. They don't offer anything. When I went into Planned Parenthood, when I was pregnant with my first son, I went into 11 Planned Parenthoods in 2 days in New Jersey, all taxpayer-funded Planned Parenthoods. And, I went through I had a whole list of questions to ask them. Like, well, if I choose to keep this fetus of this child, like, could you help me? Like, do you know of any like OBGYNs? Like, where can I get my care? Like, what do I need to start taking prenatal vitamins? I don't really know. And they were all like, we don't know. I don't know. Like, you couldn't give a woman prenatal vitamins, Planned Parenthood. You couldn't say, hey, you can go to the drugstore, get these ones with high folic acid. Like, they literally had nothing for women who didn't choose abortion if you're pregnant. Like, that's it. So yeah, I hear the social justice argument all the time, and it's very, very frustrating. Okay, so let's talk about contraception. And so we get here, I think let's start with the Catholics first. That have you ever heard an argument in favor of women using contraception from Catholics?
Yes. Not as much as I heard on the Protestant side, which is good, but too much to my liking, if that makes sense. So I have talked to a lot of individuals on the Protestant and Catholic side about contraception, and the biggest concept they like, or idea that they like, is planning their family. And they'll even say, well, I'm against abortion and you should be for birth control because that will prevent an abortion from happening. And
you don't know statistics.
Right. And so having those hard conversations with people who even disagree with the idea of abortion in general, they tend to favor things like birth control because they believe that is the way to plan your family. That will prevent an abortion from happening possibly. And I've heard that on the Catholic and Protestant side.
Which we know is not true. And I think Dr. Michael New and I discussed this, I think it was in season 2, because he's done research into this. He's a professor at CUA, Catholic University, because, that's a common misnomer you hear. But if you would look, the rates, the abortion use is gone skyrocketed with the use of contraception. And anytime they do any studies, when they look into that, when young people, because you're going to take more risks once you get on contraception. And so you might have sex with somebody who you really can't see yourself committing to for 18 years to raise another human being. Or if you're not on contraception, you might be like, no, not going to let you in this temple. So it's interesting that you open yourself up to more risky behaviors. But yet you can see, like, you look on a map, look on the charts of contraceptive use and abortion, and they both go up at the exact same time. Yeah. So the Catholic Church is very clear. Why is the Catholic Church, for our Protestant listeners, why is the Catholic Church opposed to contraception? Barrier and chemical.
Right. So I like to always point out how women in society, specifically within America, have been overly sexualized, and
we can all agree on that.
Right, and not using contraception. I know the church talks a lot about how that allows more women to be objectified, just because men, and even women, honestly, would lust after each other a lot. And it's almost like, I'm going to use your body, you're going to use my body, we're going to enjoy the situation. And I know in the Catholic Church, it does talk about the importance of having that bonding aspect as well as the procreative part. They both go in line, but neglecting that whole situation, a lot of individuals fall into just objectifying that other person, and how that can really lead on to a lot of other issues, and how if you don't use any form of contraception, it allows individuals to honestly just love each other and not really look at that individual as an object that may or may not give me pleasure. And if they don't give me pleasure, they're useless. And if you get pregnant, I don't really want you anymore. And so there's like a lot of ways you can look into it. And I know my favorite part that the church emphasizes in the Catholic Church is the objectification of the other individual. So
yeah, and so the church says that, if you're using contraceptive methods, you're basically putting a barrier between you and your spouse.
Yes.
And there's 3 people in your marriage, and God's the 3rd. So Catholics are supposed to be against barrier method and chemical contraceptives. Protestant theology doesn't have that same with barrier methods. But with chemical contraceptives, Protestants should be against chemical contraceptives as well, though, because we know now that they can be abortifacient. Not always. And I think that we don't sometimes know, and I don't think there's any definitive studies that say, oh, this is the likelihood of, an early abortion occurring if you're using the birth control pill. Now that I say that, I think I have heard some statistics about it in the past. But the thought process is, we all know someone who was using chemical contraception who got pregnant, meaning chemical contraception is not foolproof. Breakthrough ovulation still occurs because chemical contraception is supposed to stop the egg from releasing. So the egg can't be fertilized, human being can't be created. But we all know someone who's gotten pregnant using contraception. And so that means breakthrough ovulation's occurring, which then also means that 3rd mechanism, chemical contraception, which is on that big packet you get, which is if a human being is created, they call that human being a fertilized egg, that fertilized egg will not be able to implant into the uterine lining. That's an early abortion. And that is why, American College of OBGYNs in, I think, 1965 changed the definition of pregnancy from not being conception, because usually conception happens in the fallopian tube, and the fertilized egg / zygote / human being travels down to the uterine wall to implant. So they've changed the definition to say it's implantation as pregnancy. And that also allows for IVF as well, because then people will say, well, IVF isn't ending any pregnancies, but it is ending human life. They are throwing away human embryos. So I guess, so when we're talking to Protestants about contraception, what are the arguments in favor of? Is it the same? Is it just the same argument? Like, hey, I'm against abortion, I want to reduce abortions, and I'm not ready to have kids, so contraception's good for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's predominantly the path they take, but they also we have church teaching as Catholics, and as Catholics we should follow that, where there isn't.
They don't. Majority of Catholics don't.
I agree with
Please,
that.
this is not two Catholics trying to claim moral superiority, because
there are too many Catholics
so bad.
Too many Catholics I talk to just honestly don't understand church teaching in general, and I'm like, well, why are you Catholic?
It's because Catholics don't have Bible school. I'm telling you, if the Catholic Church had Bible school, so I grew up Protestant, so all parents and kids all had to go to Sunday school every Sunday, and it was a great it's where you meet your friends and stuff like that, so it's a little bit of networking too. But everybody, but the Catholic Church, you don't have that, and it's like, well, you're 13 now, go to CCD. Like, what the heck, you've wasted all these years. So don't.
No, I agree. That's why every Catholic that's listening, you guys should pick up your Bible and read it right now, because the Protestants, I look up to them honestly for how well they know Scripture. So
the argument you hear from Protestants is the same of I don't like abortion. I'm trying to reduce abortion. Therefore, I support contraception. But they don't know, one, I mean, if you're Catholic, they don't know where the teaching of the church is.
Right.
And two, even if they do know the teaching of the church, they clearly don't understand or acknowledge that human beings are being created and then they're being flushed out, early aborted out of their mothers.
Right.
And I think there's a huge, huge information gap, especially in the Protestant church, because like we never talked about that at my church. Like no one ever talked about chemical contraceptives and how chemical contraceptives could be abortifactive. I knew Catholics didn't like contraceptives, that was like a no-no. But it was just like, oh, those Catholics have a bunch of rules that are, crazy. So I think that's important that we need to continue to talk about the potential abortifactive effects of contraception. And not always, but it can happen. And once again, going back to what I said earlier about the shadow in the middle of the road at night, erring on the side of caution. And then you can also go into the whole thing about how do we have abortion today? Because of contraception. And the contraceptive mindset is what led to abortion. And contraceptive as a whole, it changed sex in America and it changed relationships in America because suddenly you didn't have to commit to spending your life with another human being to enjoy their body.
Right. No, I agree. And I was actually going to talk about that.
No,
I love that you mentioned it because the acceptance of contraception led to the demand for abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the statistics of it, right when the demand for an acceptance and tolerance of contraception went up, same thing with abortion rates. And if you look at the churches, the same thing happened with abortion, the acceptance and tolerance of abortion within churches as well. Up until the mid to late 1900s, almost every single church within Christianity were against contraception. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until, like I said, the mid to late 1900s where people started saying, like, okay, maybe in certain instances, birth control is okay. If the woman's health is at risk, then birth control is okay. The same argument they're using for abortion now.
I feel like there was an encyclical, right? Humanae Vitae?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
where a lot of this was predicted.
Right, exactly. And slowly but surely, a lot of Christians started to go with culture and think that contraception's fine because it's not abortion. And that's how Planned Parenthood actually targeted Americans at that point, because they would say, well, this is an abortion.
Yeah, there's actually, I have a Planned Parenthood brochure from like 1962. And it's like, we're against abortion. This isn't abortion. Abortion's wrong. It intentionally ends a human life. And this is Planned Parenthood's own brochure, but then making the point that, but contraception's different. And so I think you can make the argument that they knew what abortion was, but they wanted to sell people on the idea of contraceptives because they know once they start using contraceptives and they know it's not foolproof, the condom has an 18% annual failure rate. Birth control pill has a 9% annual failure rate. It was even worse back then, and way more carcinogenic, by the way, back then in the 60s and 70s, that, there would be a natural then demand for abortion because accidents were going to happen and human lives were going to be created. So, we do hear this argument from, it's sad that we still hear so many Christians making a pro-contraceptive argument. The other thing have you ever, when you're talking with a Christian who's pro-contraception, do you just bring up the base facts? You talked about the objectification of women. Mm-hmm. What about how chemical contraceptives are bad for women? Do you bring that up in your discussion?
I do. I hit a few points when I talk to people about it. The first one I go to is the objectification of women. And I do think that's spread to be accepted within society nowadays. If you see where porn has exploded in America, and I do think that's rooted in the objectification of women. Absolutely. And then going on to it actually hurts the woman in and of itself. It changes so many different things within a woman's body. Why would you want that in you? Why would you want the natural makeup of your body to be altered and to prevent a woman from doing what she was naturally created to do? And then that could cause infertility later on, and a lot of people don't like to talk about that either. So there are a few points I like to hit, and I agree 100%. Like, why as a woman would you want something like that in your body? So
yeah, I mean, don't tell me about you needing to go to an organic grocery store or only eat organic food and then be putting chemical contraceptives into your body, these fake hormones. Like, you can't. That's just hypocrisy at its worst. I mean, it actually. And there was it was Good Morning America, and it was fascinating to watch the discussion. I don't know if you saw, it was like a year ago, and a researcher from Baylor came out with a study about how chemical contraceptives change women's brains and changes your decision making. And she talked about this whole thing. And the reason she got turned on to this area of study is that she got married, went on chemical contraceptives, we're not ready right now, and then stopped desiring her husband. No sex drive, nothing. So went to a doctor. The doctor said, maybe you should got off, and then realized, like, wait a minute, what was going on here? And it almost ruined my marriage. And so she's been studying it. And it was fascinating because the women on the couch, they were, a bigger couch than this, maybe a little more comfortable because my butt is starting to hurt a little bit. The women on the couch at Good Morning America, and it was all the women, and they were all like, but contraception's been revolutionary for women. Contraception is what allowed women to succeed in the workplace. This is not, they tripped over themselves to say what a great thing contraception was. But then this researcher who then also claimed that as well, then said, but it's also changing our brains, and it's fundamentally, it's like, I was like, so you believe that there's no other choice, that women have no other option but then to put these dangerous drugs into their body that literally alters their sex drive, their decision-making abilities. We've heard this for years in the Catholic, I've heard it in the Catholic world for a long time, even before I was Catholic, of, when women are on chemical contraceptives, it actually changes who they're sexually attracted to. They're attracted to more of the dangerous type or something. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's freaking crazy. Like, that, don't talk about that. Like, that's not going to be a good messaging point. But here, this Baylor researcher was on the Good Morning America couch saying this, but saying, but I'm not saying contraception's bad, because contraception's great for women, except it changes your brains and your decision-making ability and your sexual desire. But whatever.
I think it's crazy too, because they always say society likes to push this narrative of contraception has made women succeed in the workplace. So we need this in order to be equal to men. But it's really like, no, you really just want us to be men, like men, in order to be equal to them. It's not really, okay, as a woman, we want to help you in that area. If you want to be a mom, let's help you with that. We're not going to force all these drugs on you. Almost every appointment I've been in, if I have an issue with my period, for example, the first thing they try to push on me is birth control. And I always reject it. Like, why do I need this? Why does any woman need birth control in order to, quote unquote, succeed in society? I don't need to be like a man in order to succeed. And I think a lot of times they try to harm this idea of femininity within women. And instead of encouraging that, they try to attack it and say, in order for you guys to be equal in society, you need to be like men. And I think that really hurts women in general. And that's the furthest thing from empowerment. And I think they like to push the narrative of empowerment, but really twist it on its head.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of a laziness on the medical profession too. There's a cure for your PCOS or your painful cramps that you have. It's just called birth control. When birth control actually isn't a cure, it just masks the symptoms. It doesn't make the condition go away at all. It's just kind of laziness instead of trying to figure out the problem, we're going to give you something that we think is going to mask the problem. But by the way, it has a whole host of other issues that come alongside of it. I did a really, I think probably the most downloaded podcast I've ever done was in my first season with Teresa Kenny. You guys should go check it out, on birth control, IVF, natural family planning. And she's from the Pope Paul VI Institute there in Omaha, and they're doing fantastic work, cutting edge work that frankly, most of the medical community just doesn't want to pay attention to. And it's really trying to help women who are being told you have to go on birth control, and saying, wait a minute, back up. Do you really have to? Like, I had a girl one time on a Christian campus in Whitworth in Spokane, Washington, get up and hold her birth control pills and like start yelling at me that the birth control pills were keeping her alive and that I was advocating for her death.
That's crazy.
I mean, it was like intense. And then she tried to get the Human Rights Council at the school to denounce me or something. That said that I violated her human rights by telling the truth about hormonal birth control. But so I said, I was like, you don't have to go on birth control. I'm not telling you. I'm just telling you the warning signs. And I'm telling you, if you're having sex and you're on birth control, you may be ending human life. I can't tell you if you have, but you may be. And that just set her off. So I sadly think this is something that society isn't going to get right until the church gets it right.
Yeah.
And when I mean church, I mean Christians, Protestant and Catholic. We have to be willing to talk about this. One more quick thing. I have an episode this season just on IVF. But did you ever have a discussion about IVF with Christians or Christians who are pro IVF? Because that's also one where it's the same sort of miseducation.
Mm-hmm. That generally wasn't the conversation I had. The biggest thing was birth control. I mean, if we did talk about it shortly, then we would move on to another topic, but it wasn't heavily debated, actually. The biggest thing would be birth control, specifically among people my age right now. Like, I just graduated from college. That's a huge thing among a lot of young women right now, is the idea that birth control, specifically within Christian communities that are against abortion, are favoring birth control the most. And a lot of discussions I've had on campus was mainly regarding that form of contraception.
Okay. Yeah. No, I remember right after I got married right before I turned 21. So I was 20. And I went to an OBGYN just for a checkup in Washington, D.C. And the doctor, kept trying to get me on birth control. I was like, no. And he scared the living crap out of me because he said, well, then I'm going to write you a prescription for prenatal vitamins. And you need to start taking prenatal vitamins every day because you can get pregnant at any moment. And I was like, and it was a brilliant scare tactic, because then I was like, okay, sure, write me the script for birth control, because I was like, I'm not ready, but yeah, it was completely messed up. But the pressure is real. The one thing I would say about IVF, and like I said, there's going to be an episode this season just on IVF, but from a Christian perspective, it's the same education that needs to be done within the church, because it's the question of when does human life begin. Because I've had many Christian friends. The Catholic Church has been very vocal against IVF, but obviously there's Catholics who practice IVF. But the Protestant Church, once again, there's that question. Preachers aren't talking about it. It's kind of like this thing we don't ever discuss. But there's a lot of people say, oh, isn't this great? This is a great pro-life story. All these children being conceived in IVF. But then so what I like to do, because obviously we celebrate every human life, but then I try to ask people, how do you think IVF is done? Can you explain to me what happens in an IVF procedure? Because I don't think most people actually have thought that through. Right. And that usually starts the discussion of is IVF ethical as a Christian? Because what happens is human beings are created in test tubes. Sperm and egg are created in that petri dish. Some of those embryos are then frozen. They're donated to science for research. Some of them are thrown away immediately for having, a genetic disease. And they only will, they'll screen out certain types of embryos. So embryos who have Down syndrome, embryos who would have cystic fibrosis, and they're actually getting more advanced in their genetic screening, where they're now saying, well, this is the likelihood your child will develop this type of cancer. So we got to get rid of those embryos. That is eugenics. So even, the Catholic Church talks about taking the, procreative act out of marriage and how that's wrong. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't have that theology, you should have some serious concerns about how IVF procedures are being done in our country. So hopefully we've given you guys some good talking points when talking to Christian friends, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, and maybe how to start the discussions. It's not going to be easy. Tempers might flare, so keep it calm, use facts, be loving, and just keep kind of chipping away. So anything else, Anna? Did I miss anything?
No, I think we're good.
Thank
you.
All right, Anna, what's your Instagram handle?
Anna Lulis. So Lulis, and then just Anna.
She's like good. She's excellent Instagram. Yeah. Also, don't forget to check out the Students for Life America store. We have all these new pieces of merch, t-shirts, hats, mugs, everything. So make sure you go to Students for Life. Was it SFLAshop.com, I think is the website. So check it out. We always have sales. If you sign up for our email list, you'll definitely get the sales. Thanks, guys. Don't forget to tell your friends to check out this episode, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye.